Our next speaker is Sean McDonough, a Columban priest who worked for 2 decades in the Philippines. He's a prolific writer and a great researcher. And today he will speak about ethics, algorithms, artificial intelligence, robots and drones, the gig economy, and how robots are impacting on people and work. Sean, we're so delighted you're here. You are very welcome. So over to you, Sean.
Thank you all very much. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Yes.
We can indeed.
Okay. And I'm delighted to be here. And you made the point that actually migrants bring value to people. I am not known as someone who writes on AI or robots. I've been writing on the environment for the last 45 years. And the reason for that was I ended up in the Philippines in 1969. And after doing a degree in anthropology, I went to work with a tribal group called the Tiboli. And they lived in the Dipterocarp forest of Southeast Asia. At that time, the Dipterocarp forest, you could find 120 different species of trees in every hectare. That's 5 times than you find in all of Ireland. So that's why I became interested in the environment. And I started writing on it in 1982, but actually nobody would publish my book. So it was 3 years later that I got the first book published, To Care for the Earth, A Call to a New Theology. And in a sense, I mean, at that time, Trócaire, CAFOD wouldn't actually fund anything that had to do with the environment. So that's a huge change that has taken place in my lifetime. So at the same I saw about 5 years ago, I read an article about the impact of AI, particularly on jobs. And I said, oh, gee, I think that may very well be the future. And we're not actually now focused on that sufficiently. And the article said, it was by 2 researchers in Oxford, that if we don't watch out what's happening, you might find in 20 years, which is a very short period of time, that 40% of you people will have no job, that it will be actually automated. And how is a society going to cope with the fact that 40 to 50% of our population have no jobs? Are we thinking about that in the future? And I actually don't think we are. So I began to write this book on artificial intelligence and drones. And I started with a very simple thing. When I was in Lake Cebu, my father had died the year before, and my mother I said to my mother, I would ring her once a month. And that meant actually getting a bus from Lake Cebu, which could take 5 to 6 hours, going to Davao. We didn't have a house there, so I stayed with the Maryknoll missionaries. I went down and very often called my mother because that was the only city in Mindanao that had an overseas line. And maybe you'd be there for 5 or 10 minutes. Normally it was 10 minutes you'd have checked in for, but after maybe 5 minutes, the line would go down. You get back on your bus the following day and went back to Lake Cebu. I regularly, 3 or 4 times a week now, I'm actually online to people in Lake Cebu. That's the extraordinary change that has happened. And I think it's important to recognize that too, that this has been extraordinary change. But the reality is it also has real issues and problems. And one of the things I'm very strong on is that the larger companies, the Facebooks, the Microsoft, the Twitter, they have designed themselves in such a way that there's very little poor regulation on what they do. And they're doing things which actually impact on my freedom. And that is a major issue for us. And so, but basically, that's what I decided to put out in this book, Robots, Ethics, and the Future of Jobs. And I think it's quite important for us. One of the books that was central to my writing was written by Shohana Zuboff. She teaches in Harvard. She wrote a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, the fight for human future at the new frontiers of power. And fundamentally, she's saying to you and I that these companies have so much information on you, going back over 10 or 15 years, things that you have actually forgotten long time ago, but they know them. Because fundamentally, what they are about is marketing themselves. Facebook, 98% of its revenue comes from advertising. And why they can advertise is they know so much about it, so that they know what you might do and what you will do in the future. And that makes their advertising much more subtle than advertising was in the past. Another thing we have to recognize is when I say, as Zuboff does, that maybe in 2 decades, 40 to 50% of people will not have a full-time job. You say, well, maybe that doesn't seem accurate. But the reality is as they talk about Moore's law tells us that we double our digital capacity every 4 years. I want to repeat that. The digital world goes back to the 1980s. So right up to 2020. And what I'm saying to you is that we double the capacity in 4 years. So that you just think of the potential for new robots, for new drones in the next 20 years. They are extraordinary. And the reality of artificial intelligence is that it now makes decisions, not because of the input you have put in, but because of its knowledge of understanding what's going on around them. Its extraordinary ability is to bring, to gather numbers and analyze them at an extraordinary level. So your voice, for example, or your facial expression, for example. But now they're finding it's not just one issue that it's good at. For example, your memory, but it's also very good now at understanding your voice. It also knows from your facial expression. So that is an extraordinary dimension of this that will move into the future. And we can see the awfulness of that in something like, for example, what happened in Kabul at the end of last month, when the US military took a drone and actually fired this drone at a car of somebody who had been a person working for the Western allies in Pakistan and killed 7 people. Now, in future, I have a chapter here on drones and warfare. One of the awful things will be these, unless we make decisions not to go down that road, these new weapons will be available to countries, but not just the countries. They'll be available to terrorists as well. And they're very different from nuclear weapons. When we developed nuclear weapons in the 1950s and 60s, well, the awful reality is you can't reuse them. We use them twice with awful effect. But that's not true of these. They can be used, and they are being used. And again, there's no moral reality saying what will allow me to use a drone on someone I've never met before. And I'm sitting in Washington or Dublin, and I'm directing a zone of somebody who's actually working in Kabul. So we haven't at all. That's why I have brought in the term ethics in it. We have no ethical framework to actually begin to understand how we need to change a lot of these things. And as we know ourselves, one of the things in the new media is we can say almost anything about anyone else. For example, if a person wrote some of what they say on Twitter, if they wrote it on the Irish Times, the person who was affected could take a case against me and the Irish Times. But that's not true with Facebook or Twitter, because they and the countries, the United States particularly, have designed it and such that they are not publishers, even though they very clearly are publishers. So fundamentally, there is an extraordinary movement here for very serious regulation of these companies, but also for a new ethical framework. Because if we don't have that, I wonder, did the person who actually pulled the trigger on that drone that murdered 7 people, did they have any idea what they were doing? They weren't looking down the barrel of a gun and deciding to shoot someone 500 yards in front of them. They were just pulling on a drone that had this extraordinary effect, and it's been used all over the place. The United States are using them, Russia is using them, the British forces are using them. We held yesterday from France that the French forces in West Africa used them to take out a so-called terrorists there. But where are you going to stop with using these things into the future? So in chapter 2 deals with a lot of the whole notion of algorithm and the power of algorithms. It's that here, for the first time almost ever, there's another entity that can think like humans being things, and that's going to change things dramatically in many parts of the world. And so I go on then in chapter 2, or chapter 2 to talk about. Also, chapter 2 is algorithms and AI. Then there's a new forms of development called 3D. That since World War II, for example, Western economies, because they didn't want to pay people in their countries, they decided that a lot of the manufacturing, for example, of our clothes would take place in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, and that's the context of our economies at the moment. But if 3D is landed into our country, we would be able to do all these ourselves. So the reality of what would happen, for example, to Indonesia, the Philippines, Bangladesh, who have multiple people, tens of thousands of people in the garment trade, but they don't have anything to do with it at the moment, because 3D is going to do that very easily at home, for example, in Europe, the United States, or what have you. So again, it's a new technology, but I don't think we have understood clearly what the negative side can be as well. Then I talk about robots and drones, and the various obviously it's very serious in education, in healthcare. I give an example, for example, of doctors, eye doctors working on eyes with an algorithm and with a specialist. And in some of the situations, the algorithm does better than the specialist. So what impact is that going to have on medicine? Now, you've seen in the lockdown, the impact, for example, of Zoom on education. Again, you can do wonderful things, but Zoom has many negative aspects as well. And I think many teachers who have gone back to school now, if you ask them what was their experience like for the year that they were out of school, they would say it was absolutely terrible, because they had to do so much on Zoom and on computers, but that they had no face-to-face connection with the children in school. So that's a clear warning to us again that these new technologies can be very helpful and can do good things for it, but also there's a downside to it. And one of the downsides is that in context of sharing, we do much better when people are there before us. So then I look at the future of farming. Again, even something like this, where you wouldn't think that AI and these new technologies would impact on farming, and of course they do again. In the dairy industry, I gave examples of it there, but also in the fruit industries, that they have now developed machines that actually could come and pick all the fruit that you have developed in Britain or the United States itself. But again, we haven't thought through, as this is happening, how are the people who used to come in to pick these fruits, how are they going to be dealt with in the future? Chapter 6 deals with, again, the impact of AI on caring for children, the elderly, and those with special needs. And again, very useful things can happen and can make life livable for people living at home longer and all of that, and they're very good. But we have to be very clear when we're talking about human beings, we're talking about people with real dignity. And very often as we talk, are we talking to machine or are we talking to people? And again, we haven't really thought clearly through any of that. Another area I deal with is the area of transport. And again, if you have autonomous transport in the next 20 years, like in terms of Moore's Law, for example, in the United States, there are 4 million people actually drive trucks across the states at this time. And there's a whole ancillary industry behind them, hotels and restaurants and all of those. How are they all going to work out if 90% of your movement on the roads, for example, is going to happen in autonomous trucks? So again, we need to think seriously about those issues. Then I talked about robots and warfare, which I think is very serious and very, we don't get much treatment of that now, and we should, because the armies of many countries now are focusing in the future on drone warfare, and I think it's very, very dangerous. So the fundamental point of my book is that the automation will take over many jobs, and not just all kinds of jobs. For example, if you're working in the financial sector, a whole facet of the financial sector is actually now being run by AI rather than by human beings. So various elements of people will lose their jobs. So into the future. So in chapter 10, I suggest that we should think seriously about a universal basic income. That this would be one way to make sure that you don't end up with a society where you have a small number of people extraordinarily rich and the rest of us extraordinarily poor. And if you allow the markets to dictate things, as we know, that's exactly what will happen. So it should be the time when we begin to think of how will we care for people in the future, and what financial methods need we introduce to make this possible, and to make a society which is acceptable to people, invites people in, and is also not a society with a small majority of people very rich and the rest of us very poor. And finally, I look on the whole area of this new development in the context of Catholic social teaching. So thank you.